significance. Huge significance for extradition treaties all over the world between the United States and other countries, which are often so one-sided that they allow the US to effectively police what happens in countries across the world. But this case also has huge significance for the right.
Significado particular muy grande porque tiene que ver con la libertad de expresión a nivel mundial.
Assange is being punished for no other reason than his journalistic work and exposure of war crimes, for providing a service to humanity, for lifting the lid on human rights abuses and war crimes done by the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and often done with the support of governments all across the world. So given the global nature of this case, we need to build a movement of parliamentarians across the world speaking out and calling on the Biden administration to drop the prosecution against Julian Assange. There have been some welcome shifts by the Biden administration away from the era of Trump on issues such as climate change, and we need to ensure that there is a shift on this issue too. So today, we've got 3 sessions. This first session is one in which we will listen to 2 very important guests who will update us on this case. The first guest is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, and then we will hear from Stella Morris, Julian Assange's partner. In the second session, we will hear from parliamentarians from across the world, including from Australia, and I encourage parliamentarians from each country represented here today to speak in that second session. And then finally, we will look at the next steps that politicians can be taking with opening remarks from the former Nobel Prize winner, Adolfo Perez Esquivel, and the German Member of Parliament, Sevim Dagdelen. And we'll be wrapping up by 3 p.m. London time. So with those introductory remarks over, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Niels.
Thank you very much, Richard. Is the audio okay? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for having me for this, giving me the opportunity to speak to this important audience. I think you formulated it really correctly, that this is an extremely important issue that is of great importance far beyond the person of Julian Assange. I think this case has, although obviously every case like this has a personal aspect, and I'm sure that Stella Morris afterwards will speak to that as well. But I think we all have to be to try to focus on the.
Que nous devons nous concentrer sur l'importance générale de cette affaire. Pour ce qui me concerne, j'ai été contactée par les avocats de Julian Assange en décembre 2018 et ils m'ont demandé.
I had in my own mind. So I'm telling you all of this because I think that's the most important obstacle to having a clear 2020 vision, even before 2021 this year, on this case, is that we're always looking at Julian Assange, and because most of us don't know him personally, we're looking at a persona that has been created of him or for him or in his place, mainly in various media platforms and so on over the last 10 years. And I can assure you, I've investigated this case for 2 years. There is nothing to back up this narrative. So I obviously I could speak here in very much detail to all aspects of the investigation, but I propose that I will then answer 2 questions if people want to know more specifically about specific aspects. But I'd like to focus on the state side of this. Being prosecuted, we always look at the person. We're not looking at the prosecuting side. And I'm arguing that what's being done here is a prosecution that is not pursuing law and justice, but is pursuing political purposes. And therefore, it is a persecution. It is not a prosecution. And all of this hinges on the good faith of the prosecuting states. And here I'm talking not only about the US, of those authorities, because clearly those war crimes are much more serious than what Julian Assange could ever conceivably have been committed. None of this is being prosecuted. Persecuted. He's not even a whistleblower who's had a duty of allegiance or of secrecy. He's a publicist, a journalist who has published evidence for serious crimes. Now, we can see as Swedish proceedings, clear violations of his procedural rights. I can speak to that in detail if you like. Ecuador has expelled him from the embassy without any process, has taken his statehood away, his citizenship away, without any due process. In the UK proceeding, unfortunately, to my shock, and I'm a professor at the British University myself,
not Iraqi Democrat,
I could see how his rights have been systematically violated. In the US, Julian Assange would not expect a fair trial either. The good faith of those states is also disproven by the way in which they engaged with my mandate. I'm mandated by states to report to states about their compliance with their obligations under the Convention Against Torture. And when I reported to those 4 states that I have be compliant with their human rights obligations, I'm not saying that they needed necessarily to agree with my findings that Julian Assange had been exposed to psychological torture, but by treaty law, they're obliged to, scandal-seeking kind of people. They're very experienced, independent medical experts. Both of them and myself, we all came to the conclusion that Julian Assange showed the symptoms that are typical for victims of psychological torture. And here we're talking about ill treatment that is comparable to a type of mobbing that we would know from our private lives, or that everyone would be familiar with. It's a very common method of psychological torture because it doesn't leave physical traces, but is extremely destructive to the human mind and emotional stability in the long term. And it has several components. It always includes a form of isolation, social isolation or physical isolation. In Julian Assange's case, we progressively have both of those aspects. Then there is a threat scenario that is there, that something bad could happen. Human rights organizations agree that the conditions of detention for political detainees or let's say national security detainees in the US amount to inhumane and cruel treatment. And so we have the isolation, we have the threat scenario, we have the constant arbitrariness of official behavior. And here we're talking to his constant violations of his procedural rights. He doesn't get access to his lawyers. He doesn't get access. Had hundreds of doctors intervening internationally with the British government. We've had the European Parliament passing resolutions. We've had the International Bar Association protesting officially against the unfair trial that Julian Assange is getting. We've had Amnesty International speaking out against his extradition. Even New York Times, The Guardian, who have been critical to some aspects of WikiLeaks' work in the past, have very clearly spoken out against the unjust treatment of Julian Assange. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations years ago has decided that his confinement in the embassy is arbitrary. I have investigated this case. I have no personal stakes in this case. And I was even biased, I admit it, to my shame, biased against Julian Assange in the beginning. But once I looked at the fact, it was clear that this is not a prosecution, it is a persecution. Now, let us not, and I will close on this last aspect, let us not be misled by the seemingly positive result of the judgment of 4th of January, which refuses extradition for espionage, which basically sets a precedent case that what Julian Assange has done, which is investigative journalism, is a crime under the Espionage Act. And not only that, but also under the British Official Secrets Act. So it also really concerns every single British citizen. They could be criminalized for exposing dirty secrets, if you allow me that term, of the government. And so the prison conditions in the US would be oppressive too, in view of the mental health of Julian Assange. Now that's a little bit of a trap, because in the appeals case now, obviously, the only question the US will appeal is that precise question on whether their conditions of detention are inhumane and whether they're acceptable to Julian Assange. And so now here they can make diplomatic assurances with regard to those conditions and thereby remove that obstacle fairly easily. And the whole appeals proceeding has now been reduced to that discussion. We're no longer discussing political offense. We're no longer discussing press freedom. We're no longer discussing war crimes. We're only discussing those assurances, and they can easily be given by the US. And afterwards, as we know, those assurances are not always respected in practice. So I think it's more of a maneuver to reduce and focus the appeals proceeding to something that's beneficial to the US than that this is really about an expression of consideration of humanity on behalf of Julian Assange. And I can even prove that with a final point. If the judge considers that solitary confinement in the US is inhumane and oppressive and would lead Julian Assange back to solitary confinement in the UK, where there is no need and no legal basis to keep him in solitary confinement. He's not serving a sentence. He is only being kept there in confinement to assure his presence in case he should be extradited. So it's a preventative detention so he doesn't escape. But you don't need solitary confinement.
Many thanks, Niels, and we'll come on to questions after our next speaker. But I want to say that we've been joined since the start also by representatives from Argentina, from Belgium, and from Ireland and Norway as well. And in fact, we've had over 40 international guests registered for today's event. And I think that just goes to show the strength of feeling from parliamentarians across the globe on this crucial issue. And on that note, I'd like to invite Stella to address the meeting.
Hi, Richard. Thank you. Last Sunday was the 2-year anniversary of Julian's arrest and incarceration in Belmarsh. And there were protests and vigils on 5 continents, and the story was in the major UK newspapers. A double-decker bus was filled with people and draped with Free Assange. And it followed the path from Julian's arrest at the Ecuadorian embassy to Belmarsh prison, where Julian has been buried from public view for the past 2 years. If it weren't for Julian's calls with me and a limited number of people, he would have no idea what was going on, not only around the world, but just 50 yards from the cell that holds him. Not to charge Julian, because Julian's conduct was no different to that of the rest of the press. Charging Julian would mean criminalizing journalism. Obama pardoned the alleged source, Chelsea Manning, who was free. The charges brought by Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration. To date, Julian has suffered severe punishment through process, surrounded by the worst murderers and drug dealers in Britain. He's in a prison where prisoners are killed through murder or suicide every few months. He faces 175 years, or however many life sentences, if you want to quantify. Let's pause and think about what the US case against Julian is actually saying. The US government is claiming that journalists all over the world have no freedom of expression rights and protections because they are not US citizens, that US criminal laws apply to them, but the First Amendment does not, even when they are in their own countries. If everything else was the same, if Julian was in London working for WikiLeaks, but he had an American passport, then he might have a defense. But because of the single fact that he does not have an American passport, he doesn't. If the case would have been drawn out and publicly ridiculed, the case against Julian is the ultimate realization of Trump's America First policy. It has added an aggressive new dimension to American exceptionalism that removes our rights as non-Americans in our own countries and infringes our sovereignty. Reporters Without Borders and the National Union of Journalists in the UK have said that as long as Julian is in prison and faces extradition, the UK is not a safe place for journalists and publishers to work. The Trump administration advancing governments to turn. Those governments must constantly crash into this case, just like Saudi Arabia does with the Khashoggi assassination. It is too late for Khashoggi, but it is not too late for Julian. As lawmakers, you have unique avenues and powers at your disposal to press. I'd like to thank Richard Bergen for organizing the symposium, the cross-parliamentary groups in Australia, Germany, and the UK for the work they have already done to put an end to this, and to each of you individually and collectively for stepping up to save Julian's life and our collective freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. Now we have